Eddie Nelms, you worked in London about 10 years ago. You worked in New York for London-based Word Search and are now back in London working. Now, the death of George Floyd and the whole Black Lives Matter movement has had a global impact and given us all a jolt that we must do better to support diversity in our lives and in our jobs. So you're a successful, well-respected in what you do. You move among what one might describe as liberal groups. Can you talk a little bit about what you're up against as a Black person and the issues your white colleagues don't have to face and perhaps don't understand or even perhaps aren't aware of?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, LA. I think these are some really good questions to start with. This is an important issue to me. Obviously, being a Black person, it's something I think about on a regular basis, both professionally and socially. Um, uh, you know, I, I guess the easiest way to start to talk about this is, and you may remember this, is that there's a really important movie that my parents had me watch many years ago called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. It was a film with Stanley. It was a film by Stanley Kramer with Audrey Hepburn and Sidney Poitier, and it was a story about an interracial couple that had fallen in love, and in a very difficult, segregated United States at the time in the 1960s, and it showed that effectively that the challenges that one has being Black effectively in a white world, and the challenges that exist. And the reason why I'm mentioning this example is because oftentimes for me, and these are my personal experiences that I can share with you all, I'd rather not try to speak for obviously for the larger Black community in the UK and the US, but for me personally, oftentimes I feel that when I'm in a room, oftentimes with colleagues or in this situation, that being the only Black person in the room, that you are in a position to need to prove yourself all the time, that you need to what we call sort of as passing in a way, which is, do I sound like you? Do I present myself as educated? Do I look like you in terms of my style and my dress? And even with my haircut, for example, is it presentable in a way? Something that isn't oftentimes too ethnic in many respects. Do I know the same things, go to the same places on vacation as you? And so those senses of familiarity are oftentimes what I think the larger white majority are looking for. And I think with Black Lives Matter particularly is, there was an anger and a frustration with that idea of just simply passing, and that the idea of conforming is not enough anymore, and that the passing isn't working. And that we're seeing violent incidents happening even in an effort of trying to do that. And so we as a society don't know what the answer is in both countries, frankly, but we do know that we need to start being much more open-minded, and there are some specific things that I think we can do that hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about in this interview today. I would also add one more example to that first question, Peter, is that it's oftentimes that you feel, particularly in a networking event, for example, when you go to a networking event, that even though there may be situations that you may know a few people, oftentimes I'll be the only person of color in the networking event. And I particularly, in fact, choose not to attend many because of the reason of the challenges that you have, is that many people assume that that they see you're a person of color, that you're not very senior at the business that you're running, basically. And that only when I wear a name tag that it actually says my title on it, do I tend to get usually the interaction that one would normally get at a networking event. And I think that's partly because, and something we may talk about later, is that there are just so few people of color in leadership positions within the property sector that it would almost be impossible, that the percentage is so low that if you have only 20 minutes to talk to someone at a networking event, you well want to make sure that the person is someone senior that you're going to get value from, basically. And so and so typically, I prefer one-on-one meetings with people when they know, my title, they know my background, and they know that it's going to be a valuable meeting for them versus a networking event. And and there's also sort of the larger issue of just, frankly, this is just potentially my personal issue, is that when you're standing alone at a network event and no one's talking to you, because you're the only person of color, everyone notices that. One could argue that could be an advantage and a disadvantage. I find that it feels more a disadvantage because I'm always forced to feel like I need to be talking to someone. Otherwise, if I stand alone, everyone will notice. And but I think everyone to a degree has that fear. But I think for people of color, I think it's a little bit more exasperated in the situation. And so, but I don't want to say it's anyone's fault per se. I only want to just raise this as something to recognize, and that I understand that people tend to want to talk to others that are of similar background, potentially similar race, that they have a connection, immediate connection. Talking to someone of a different race is obviously that there is definitely a difference, and so that is another example.
So what do you see are the main difference between your experiences in the States and in the UK?
I think that I think we could definitely do better within property. I think that it is an industry that, like real estate, it tends not to move very quickly. And when I say property, I really am talking about the shifting in the office environment, particularly, that it has moved very slow over the years, and very little has changed. But the most important thing, I think the biggest similarity between the two regions for me is that there are very few limited success stories, that there are so few people in leadership roles within property, but in both countries. And the structures are very different between both countries, and actually how their property companies are structured in a way, meaning that, for example, in the United States, you have, particularly in urban centers, you tend to have mostly family-led, small, private developers. So my father X, take Donald Trump, for example, my father X created this development company, and now I'm the son and I'm running the company, kind of scenario. And the company culture very much embodies the family. Whereas I don't think that's true in the UK. I'm sure there are definitely some family-run businesses here, family-run property businesses, but it feels much more corporate in the structure. That it feels much more less about a name of the family, on the door, and more about sort of a more holistic approach. But that being said, I still think that there could be definitely more leadership roles for people of color, because I think we need to see ourselves. The idea of being able to aspire to something, to achieve, to work towards being able to get there is you need to see that someone else has done it in many cases. Because oftentimes I feel like I'm a trailblazer, like many other people in property. They probably do that. We are the first in the field that we're in, and the role that we're in. And we need to make sure that we succeed, because we don't really have very much choice. That everyone is looking at us, in show. If they succeed, wonderful, we'll add more people of color to the company. If they fail, we may consider not. And so carrying that burden oftentimes can be very challenging and very difficult. And it's about understanding that and being sympathetic and empathetic to that situation.
So I guess, as you said, the built environment sector is largely white professionals who are creating living and working spaces for multi-ethnic communities. But so we do really need to ensure that we have diverse voices in the discussion and debate about what happens in the built environment and how we design for it.
Yeah, I think that's right, Peter. But I would probably slightly tweak this question a little bit, because I think that I think architects and designers are listening. I think that there's planning policy that is established to ensure that everyone has a voice in the room. I think the challenge that I'm seeing is really it's not the listening, it's really the understanding of what it means, of what you're actually hearing from communities. And I was thinking about an example the other day about a project many years ago that I worked on, where the African American community, this is a project in the United States, the African American community, and I think it's applicable here too, that they they wanted to have spaces that they could bring lawn chairs and have barbecues. So they needed a hardscape surface to be able to do that. They did not want a grassy sort of surface. However, a grassy surface typically looks better visually from a flat or from a house or something. And so it was, the challenge was getting the designers to reconcile what the community really wanted and needed to foster their own culture versus what was aesthetically perceived as being a better design decision. And I think that is the struggle that designers that you're implying, that white designers have an aesthetic that they are trying to perpetuate and that they're used to culturally. And it doesn't always gel very well with other different kinds of communities. And so, I think we are listening. I think that we need to push design further. We need to really push that, push the envelope much further in trying to come up with better solutions for that. And there also just the fact of just, there also seems to be a bit of a mistrust typically within communities of color with architects and designers. And so finding ways, I think that will help by finding better ways of improving design and addressing their issues will ultimately help create better synergies between these communities and the design community.
So what do you think employers in the business should do to improve the situation?
Yeah. I think there are three things that they could do. I would first say that we need to find a way to change the perception in the industry. So that goes back to my first point about we need to see more people in senior level roles so that we can believe that this is a profession that we are accepted in and that we are invited into. It's one thing just to sort of say it; it's another thing to really move forward with it. So I think that's one really important aspect. So that's the perception issue, and probably the most challenging, frankly. And then I think the second one is retention. We need to find better ways of retaining our people of color within the within the built environment community. And so those could be small gestures, recognizing specific holidays within their community. I don't know if you saw in the U.S., the June 18th situation, and then with various larger companies sort of offering that holiday. But it's really, at the moment, it just feels like corporate culture is just very unwelcoming within the built environment. And so how can we find a better way to make that culture much more collaborative and much more inclusive? And then last, I would say, is recruitment. But I think if you can get the first two right, the recruitment bit should be relatively easy. If you could show people of color that there's that the perception is changing and that people actually enjoy working there, then the recruitment bit will come naturally. I feel like I don't think you have to do a whole lot of work on that. But if you feel like you need to, obviously, I think there's definitely opportunities to reach out more. I mean, I'm not an HR director, Peter. So, but I'm sure that many companies are already reaching out to various, recruitment agencies and explaining that they need more people of color. And I gather that is how that is happening at the moment. But anyway, those are the three things that I would suggest.
Yes, well, as you say, a lot of organizations are now taking this issue much more seriously than maybe they did in the past. And I would say at NLA, we also are very conscious we need to do more, both in our own organization, but also in the voice we're able to give to the industry more generally. So what would you like NLA to be doing to sort of move things forward a bit?
I mean, it's wonderful the work that NLA is already doing. I mean, even just these sort of, these interviews are a really great place to start. I think there are a few things that NLA, a few more things that NLA could be doing, and I would probably suggest maybe a speaker, maybe an expert panel on diversity in the workplace. I know that it isn't specifically focused on architecture or the built environment, which is traditionally what your expert panels have focused on. Sustainability issues, transportation, those kinds of really issues within the built environment. But I think this one is important enough, and I think we need to find ways that we have to weave it in and start to have a dialogue about it. And the panel may result in recommendations that could be immensely valuable to everyone within the built environment community. And then maybe if there was and maybe you do this already, I'm not entirely sure, but a design prep program, like a summer school program, basically introducing 15 and 16-year-old students to various professions within a built environment so they can get exposure. This is the perception issue that I was mentioning earlier. I think if we can find a way to, when they choose their career path, that, you know, a profession in the built environment, architecture, construction, engineering, you know, property development, all those things are highly considered. This may already exist in some form or fashion in the UK. I'm not entirely sure. And then I think we as a community of people of color can do more ourselves, but we need a facilitator, and NLA I think can be that. So if we're having quarterly networking events potentially where we're bringing all the people of color together, you know, I can't tell you how often it is when I see another Black person working in property, how rare it is, and this sigh of relief, like, oh, look, there's another person across the hall, like, and so I, you know, we don't know everyone, and I think NLA has the ability of connecting everyone really well. And I think we need to meet each other and then kind of figure out what we can do as a community ourselves to help further things along. I don't want to say that is the entire responsibility of the larger majority to answer all these questions and to do all the heavy lifting. I think, yes, there is some responsibility of the larger white majority in society, but there is some responsibility for us too. You know, there's so few people of color that are developers because they don't have access to funding. You know, it's the network of being able to build something that is really the challenge, and it's being able to know those connections, to have that network, that, you know, basically the social club, you know, to a degree, and we don't have that at all. And so you may have ambitious, talented people, but they're going to run into a glass ceiling at some point when it comes to the funding aspect of their aspirations, to be able to become developers. And you know, those are things that need to change, and those are things that, you know, funding, for example, is not an LA responsibility. That is primarily lending and banking, for example, but it is related to the development process. But it isn't specifically the built environment, so to say, you know. And so I want to make sure that, you know, when we do these panels we talk about diversity, that we're not just pigeonholing it by talking to people that are only within the built environment. And we need to be talking to everyone outside of that. Well, in addition to those people within the built environment, we need to be using other people as a sounding board to say, it's worked really well in this industry, can we use it in our industry? You know, I just want to make sure we're not just talking to ourselves over and over and over again, and we're not really getting anywhere in the end. And I think we can do that.
Great. Eddie Nelms, thank you very much indeed for your comments, your insights, and your contribution, and we'll certainly take you up on some of those issues. And we look forward to your new role in the UK, which I'm sure you will be a very powerful voice. Thank you.
Yeah.